What do you think God is like? Your view of God sets the course for your own life. Welcome to you, to the People's Church, Constantia, Cape Town. My name is Jeff Bond, and thank you for taking the time to watch. I trust that what we say today is going to be helpful to you in your journey, your own spiritual journey. We're all on a journey, and we make no boasts about ourselves. It's a case of one beggar telling another beggar where to find some bread, and that's what we are hoping to do today. Our church is in Constantia, Cape Town, a beautiful part of South Africa. If you are ever in these parts, you'll find a warm welcome if you come and join us. Mid-sized church, a diverse congregation, diverse demographic in the church, age-wise and in every other way as well. And it's just good for us to be together. We are on a theme called It Really Is Good News. Not it is really good news, but it really is good news. The thought underpinning what we are saying is that we have a way of taking the gospel, which is good news, and we water it down by qualifying it in some way or another. And last week, we read the story of the woman in Simon the Pharisee's house. And you can get that and hear what we said about her and Simon as well, and about the Lord, and he's dealing with both of them. And today we will read of another woman, and I'm going to read to you from John chapter 8, the story of the woman who was caught in adultery. I'm reading from the NIV version. At different times I'll use other versions, but for the reading today, John chapter 8, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. He slept there. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group, and they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such woman. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down, and he wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up, and he asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and live your life of sin." Quite a story, that. You'll see that this woman is never named. And the woman who was in Simon's house, who was described as a sinner, was never named. And this woman at Jacob's well, who had had 6 husbands, was never named. There's a reason. The reason being that these people had a future to live out. They may have been in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. They most likely were a part of the Jerusalem church. And they were identified not by what they used to be, but what they were becoming. And so it's not a case of, oh, she was the woman who was caught in adultery, or she was the woman who had so many husbands. They weren't allowed to be labeled in that way. An important lesson, an important Bible truth. We need to drop the labels. We take on a new identity when we become Christians, and we should not allow ourselves to be labeled. Oh, you used to stick people to their past, make them drag their history with them. No, we must drop the labels. The story starts at dawn, very early in the morning. It's quite clear if you read the previous chapter. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. He spent the night there. He used to go and pray at the Mount of Olives, and it was early in the morning. He came down to the temple, and he started to teach. He would sit down as I'm sitting down now, and a crowd of people would gather. I wonder what he was preaching on, what he was teaching on at that time, whatever it was. It was something that people had a hunger for, a thirst for. There was a large crowd. People swarmed to hear him when he spoke. And as he was speaking, and he was talking about important things that was important for a lot of people, there was a disruption. Into the gathering came some Pharisees and keepers of the law, teachers of the law. They were dragging a woman. I don't know whether she was using her legs and they were making her walk, or whether she was refusing to walk and they were dragging her behind them. But I know that she was humiliated, she was disgraced, she was terrified, she would have been full of dust. It was a terrible, horrible scene. And so this crowd of people listening to Jesus has this humiliating woman thrust in the center of their attention. They are imposed upon this event. You know, legalism, law, keeping the law, keeping rules, it's a very ugly thing. This was an ugly scene. And one wonders what these men were thinking. One wonders what was going on in their minds. What did they think they were achieving by dragging this woman to such an event, to such a moment, to such a place, to Jesus? They had a fish to fry. There's no question about that. The story says that they wanted to trap Jesus. But before I get to the trap, I wonder what their view of God was. They were the keepers of the law. They were the religious people. And I wonder what their view of God was, that they thought that God would say, go for it. Well done. What sort of a God would approve of that? What would make them think that this was an appropriate thing that they were doing, and that this was an appropriate thing for the cause of the God that they served? You know, your view of God is very, very important. Your view of God sets the course for your own life. What do you think God is like? You can think about that for a moment. What is your view of God? You can live in God's house, and you can have a distorted and an inadequate view of God. The prodigal son. In that story, the prodigal son lived in his father's house, but he never understood his own father. He lived there, but he never got his father. But when he returned, he said, even my father's servants have got food to eat. He knew that the servants were well treated, and so he set as his goal that he would make me as one of your hired servants. But he had no idea or sense of the extent, the height, the depth, the length, the dimensions of the love that his father had for him. He never got his father, even though he was living in the home. Paul prays for the church in Ephesus. Ephesians 1:17, the second part of that verse, he says, I pray that you might know God better. What is your view of God? What do you think he is like? It really is God's news. When the prodigal son saw the father running down the road as he did, he would have been amazed. Wow, look how pleased he is to see me. He never expected that. When the party was underway and the aunties were saying, now turn the music down, it's too loud, and we get to disturb the neighbors. When the party was really going well, the prodigal son would have looked around and thought, I never knew the old man had this party in him. I thought that this place was boring, but look at what's happening. You see, our view of God can give us a distorted relationship with God. I pray that you'll get to know God better as we go through this series. It really is good news. Wow, I lived in his house for so long and I never even knew him. The Pharisees had a distorted view of God. They thought, I presume, that somehow they were representing God when they dragged a dusty, humiliated, terrified woman through the streets to the temple, which was, think of Cavendish, or the center of civic life at that time. Think of the city hall. That's where they dragged her to. So stop and think for a moment. What is your view of God? How do you imagine him when you talk about God and your name comes up? What do you think the expression of on his face is? Will you pray? Imagine, use your imagination. God gave it to you. What sort of expression does God have on his face? Disappointment, boredom, disgust, disapproval, anger, hardness, just loss of concentration, don't even know that you're there. These men were displaying their view of their God, and what an ugly view they had, and what an ugly representation of God. Crude, harsh, merciless, unjust. To talk about the trap, they were wanting to catch Jesus out. They were wanting Jesus to reject the law of Moses. Then they would have something on the religious basis to accuse him of. They were wanting him to say, stone the woman, which is what the law maintained. And then he would be breaking the law of Rome. There was no right answer here, because the Jews were not allowed to give a death sentence to anyone. Only the Roman government could sentence someone to death and could execute someone. So they wanted to set him up as weak and prevaricating and compromising. That was what their goal was. Legalism, laws. Legalism in church life is ugly. Legalism in church life is selective. Legalism in church life is straining out a gnat, or we would say a michi, and swallowing a camel. It's taking out something small that you don't want to swallow, but swallowing something that is just ridiculously huge. Legalism in church life is throwing the dart and then drawing the bullseye around where the dart landed. Legalism is not helpful. For you, the thing might be wine. When we were in Paris, we spent some time with an Assemblies of God minister who has a church in the center of Paris, and he took us on a walking tour of Paris, and we went and we had dinner in their home, and so I asked a question in the Assemblies of God, and here, what is your view on wine? He said, this is France. That was his answer. And the evidence was clear that they drank wine. But maybe you think that's the mother of all sins. We heard last week For some, it's covering your knees. For some, it's tobacco. Don't smoke. So you're not allowed to smoke, but you can carry a 9mm parabellum on your hip, and you're quite willing to use it as well. Don't listen to rock and roll, but racism in your conversation is not even noticed. It's second nature and it's habitual. You see, legalism, this is wrong. It's always selective, and we leave other things out. In this story, nobody asked the obvious question. That's another habit of legalism. Don't ask the obvious questions. Here's the obvious question that you are asking, and I'm asking as well. It's a screaming question. It's impossible to commit adultery by yourself. Where's the man? They drag the woman in, but they leave the man out. But before we are overcome with self-righteous indignation about the legalism in others and the ugliness of hypocrisy, let us pause and let us examine ourselves. Our own society, it seems to me, is given to ripping into itself via social media what is right and what is wrong. We are a very legalistic society, and we shame people and we call people out for all manner of things. The church, with a capital C, is ever alert to the failings of branches of the church, little churches, the things that they do wrong, whatever the style might be that is out of favor. There is a pharisaical blindness in our own society that we need to avoid. And so the story of the woman caught in adultery is not a how could they story. It's a cautionary lest we also story. They dragged the woman into Jesus' presence, and they asked him questions, and they wanted to set him up and engage him in a debate. He never said a word. He just stood up, saw what they were doing, and then he crouched down to the ground, very dramatic, wouldn't look at them, and he started to write with his finger in the sand. Can you imagine? The eyes moved from the woman to the accusing Pharisees, and then their eyes, everybody's eyes, were riveted on Jesus' finger writing in the sand. There's been a great deal of speculation about what he was actually writing in the sand, but it is clear that whatever he was writing had an impact on the lynching mob. He bent over. He didn't want to look at them, nor did he want to stare at the humiliated woman. He looked at the ground and he started to write. What was he writing? I've heard it said that he was just embarrassed. Didn't want to look, and he was just doodling, just drawing diagrams or something in the sand. Some people speculate that he was writing down names. Jacob standing there. Esther, he knows what he's been doing with Esther. The date and the place, maybe. And Jacob's eyes get big, and Jacob says to himself, let me get out of here. Names of people and infidelities, explosive information perhaps. The accuser started to melt into the crowd. Let me go before it gets to my name. Started with the oldest ones. I think the oldest, either because they'd been up to it longer, or else they were the wiser. But they started from the older, and they were the most experienced in life. They knew this wasn't going to end well. And they slipped away, one by one. They arrived as a party, but they slipped away quietly, disappeared, dissolved. The party dissolved. Jesus can write to the sand with his finger about each one of our lives. Actually, accusations, where we like to accuse one another. Romans 14 verse 10. So where does that leave you when you criticize a brother? And where does that leave you when you condescend to a sister? I'd say it leaves you looking pretty silly, or worse. Eventually, we're all going to end up side by side in the place of judgment facing God. Your critical and condescending ways aren't going to improve your position there one bit. And then Romans 14 verse 12. So tend to your knitting. You've got your hands full just taking care of your own life before God. So it doesn't do good for us to be accusing one another of one thing and another. Let's move on to it really is good news. Jesus and this woman. He stands up. He says, you who have no sin, you throw the first stone. Then he bends down and starts writing again. So he bends down and writes twice. And then when they are gone, he straightens up and he says to the woman, woman. When he says woman, it's not a woman, it's a word of respect. It's the same word, exactly the same title that he used of his mother at the time when the miracle of the turning of the water into wine was used. There was a term of respect and deference. And so it doesn't translate well in modern language. He says, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. She said, this woman has moved out from the shadow of other people's opinions of her. And she is now standing before the one person whose opinion really counts. And you need to move into that same place. You need to move away from other people's opinions of you. And you need to seek out and find out what Jesus' opinion of you is. What Jesus thinks of you is the most important thing about you. Then Jesus says to the woman, neither do I condemn you. Jesus declared, it's a statement. He says, then I don't condemn you either. He says it loud and clear. It's not her opinion. It's his opinion told to everybody. I don't condemn you. What a thing. What a thing that Jesus says to this woman who's caught out like this. He says, I don't condemn you. It really is good news. Jesus isn't condemning you. He's not viewing you as rubbish. He's not viewing you as wrong and as a lost cause and as filthy. That's not how he's looking at you. Neither do I condemn you, said Jesus. Jesus could condemn her because she was wrong. And Jesus was not condoning her actions. Jesus was not going soft on sin. But Jesus was able to forgive. And Jesus was able to not condemn. And he was able to say what he just said. Because he was willing and he was soon going to pay the price for what she had done. He was going to take her sinfulness and take it upon himself. We sing Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. It really is good news. And the event ends with these words, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." It's not a wagging finger. Don't do this again. Not at all. Condemnation. The feeling of the wagging finger. Wendy and I went to a healthy weight program at the Sports Science Institute near the Newlands rugby ground. Very good program. I recommend it. It was done professionally. It was helpful. It was beneficial to us. It was so effective. I'll leave it there. It was effective. But before we started the program, we had to fill in a questionnaire, and we were asked questions by the person across the desk. What is your weight? They actually wanted to know what you weighed, not what you... They wanted to know your proper weight. Well, that was a hard number to actually say. Then they asked questions about your eating habits. They said, how many slices of bread do you eat a day? Am I going to tell the truth here or not? Then they say, when you spread butter on the bread, do you spread it so thick that it leaves tooth marks? How gross. Yes, it leaves tooth marks. I felt that wagging finger, condemning finger. The feeling of being an irresponsible glutton that made me want to run away. That's very often how we feel when we come to church. That this questionnaire that we're going to have to fill in somewhere along the line, through the message or through the songs or through the Bible readings, we're going to feel like irresponsible sinners. Doesn't sound like good news, and we already feel bad about ourselves. This wasn't a finger-wagging exercise when he said, go now and leave your life of sin. It was a word of empowerment. He was saying to this woman, you don't have to live like this any longer. You can be free of whatever was driving you before, whatever needs you felt before. It doesn't have to be this way any longer. Your life can change. Go into a fresh life and a fresh lifestyle, is what he was saying. When you come to Jesus, you are not met with condemnation. When you come to Jesus, you are invited to walk into a fresh and empowering life. So that woman went away. She escaped with her life. You escaped, but you moved into a new life. I do believe that same woman, I've got no proof for it, but I do believe that the same woman put her trust in Jesus. I do believe that same woman went on to live a productive and happy and different life. It really is good news. And so I'm going to pray with you right now. Let's bow our heads. Dear Lord Jesus, we're coming to express our trust in you and your goodness and your kindness. We're coming like the prodigal son returning, and we know we're going to have a warm welcome. We're coming, even though we are so guilty, we're coming knowing that we're going to hear words not of condemnation, but words of empowerment. It really is good news. We thank you, Lord Jesus, for the way that you are. Amen.